A southern light beckons. Picture this with me, if you will. The weight of another sleepless night pressing against your shoulders as you finally set aside the endless stream of decisions that fill your days. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere different. Somewhere where the light itself becomes a teacher, and where one man's relentless pursuit of beauty, in the face of overwhelming darkness, might speak to the burdens you carry. It's February 1888, and a train pulls into the small station at Arles, in the heart of Provence. The doors open with a mechanical sigh, and out steps a man whose restless energy seems to vibrate in the very air around him. Vincent van Gogh, 35 years old, red-bearded, intense eyes scanning the platform with the particular alertness of someone who has spent too many nights wrestling with thoughts that refuse to settle. He carries little with him: a worn canvas bag containing brushes, tubes of paint, and a few personal belongings. But what he seeks, what has drawn him nearly 500 miles south from the gray winters of Paris, that weighs far more than any physical burden. Vincent has come here chasing light. Not just any light, mind you, but something specific. Something he believes might finally allow him to capture what burns so fiercely in his imagination. The harsh, honest light of the Mediterranean sun. The kind of illumination that doesn't flatter or soften, but reveals everything exactly as it is. As he steps onto the platform, the February air carries something different than what he's known in the north. Even in winter, there's a quality here. A clarity that makes colors seem more themselves. The sky holds a particular blue that will soon become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. You know that feeling, perhaps, when you're building something that matters deeply to you, and you sense you're on the edge of a breakthrough. That mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Vincent carries that same energy as he makes his way through the narrow streets of Arles, looking for lodging, looking for a place to set up his easel, looking for, well, he's not entirely certain what he's looking for, but he knows he'll recognize it when he finds it. The town itself seems to drowse in the afternoon sun. Ancient Roman stones warm themselves against the Mediterranean light, and the locals move with the unhurried rhythm of people who understand that some things cannot be rushed. Vincent's intensity stands in sharp contrast to this measured pace. He walks quickly, his eyes darting from shadow to highlight, already composing paintings in his mind. What drives a man to uproot his entire life in pursuit of something as intangible as the quality of light? This is the question that will follow us through Vincent's journey. And perhaps it echoes something in your own experience. That sense that what you're building requires not just effort, but the right conditions, the right environment, the right illumination. Vincent finds modest rooms in the Café de la Gare, and almost immediately begins to write letters to his brother Theo back in Paris. His words pulse with excitement. I think that the spring here must be quite different from spring in the north. Already I can see that everything is early here. Early. There's something profound in that observation. In Paris, Vincent had felt perpetually behind the other artists, behind the movements, behind some invisible schedule that everyone else seemed to follow effortlessly. But here, perhaps, he might finally be early to something, present at the beginning of his own artistic flowering. The first weeks pass in a blur of discovery. Vincent sets up his easel in the fields surrounding Arles, where almond trees are beginning to show the first hints of spring blossoms. The light here behaves differently than in the north. It doesn't creep tentatively across the landscape. It arrives with confidence, transforming everything it touches. He paints the blossoming branches against skies of impossible blue. Colors that would seem garish anywhere else feel perfectly natural here. The yellow of the sun doesn't compete with the blue of the sky. They dance together, each making the other more vivid, more alive. But Vincent's pursuit goes deeper than simply capturing pretty scenes. He's wrestling with something more fundamental. How do you paint not just what you see, but what you feel? How do you translate the weight of your inner world onto canvas in a way that others might understand? These are the questions that keep him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his small room while the rest of Arles sleeps peacefully around him. The same kind of restless energy that might keep you turning over problems long after your body has demanded rest. Vincent writes to Theo, "I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal, which the halo used to symbolize. There's something beautiful and heartbreaking in that ambition, to capture not just the surface of things, but their essential nature, their eternal quality." As spring deepens into early summer, Vincent's work begins to change. The careful, measured brush strokes of his earlier period give way to something more urgent, more expressive. The paint itself becomes part of the message. Thick, swirling, alive with movement, even in stillness. He paints the postman, Joseph Roulin, a man with a magnificent beard and kind eyes, who becomes one of his first friends in Arles. In Vincent's hands, this simple postal worker becomes something heroic. The blue of his uniform doesn't just sit on the canvas. It vibrates with dignity and warmth. But even as his art flourishes, Vincent struggles with the isolation that often accompanies deep creative work. The weight of his vision, the intensity of his perception, it can be overwhelming. He dreams of creating an artists' community here in the South, a place where painters might gather, share ideas, support each other through the inevitable valleys that come with pursuing something meaningful. He rents a small yellow house on Place Lamartine and begins preparing it for visitors. Each room is painted with careful attention to color and mood. This will be his studio, his sanctuary, his invitation to fellow artists to join him in this experiment with light and community. The yellow house becomes his anchor in Arles, not just a place to sleep and work, but a symbol of possibility. When you're building something that matters, whether it's a business, a movement, or simply a better version of yourself, you need those anchors, those physical reminders of what you're working toward. Vincent paints sunflowers to decorate the rooms. Not delicate, precious flowers, but bold, generous blooms that seem to contain the very essence of the southern sun. These paintings will become some of his most beloved works, but in the moment, they're simply Vincent's way of preparing a welcome for the community he hopes to build. The summer heat intensifies, and with it, Vincent's productivity reaches extraordinary levels. He paints almost daily, sometimes multiple canvases in a single session. The wheat fields around Arles become his cathedral, and he captures them at different times of day, in different seasons, under different skies. There's something deeply moving about watching Vincent work during this period. The way he throws himself completely into each painting, holding nothing back. The way he finds the eternal in the everyday. A pair of worn boots, a simple bedroom, a cafe at night. But perhaps what's most remarkable is how Vincent transforms his struggles into something beautiful. The restless energy that keeps him awake at night. He channels that into swirling skies that pulse with movement. The intensity that makes simple social interactions difficult. That becomes the passionate brushwork that brings his subjects to life. He's learning something that might speak to your own journey. That the very qualities that make life challenging, the sensitivity, the high standards, the inability to settle for less than your vision demands, these same qualities can become your greatest strengths when properly channeled. As autumn approaches, Vincent receives word that Paul Gauguin, a painter he deeply admires, has agreed to visit Arles. The Yellow House will finally serve its intended purpose as a gathering place for artists. Vincent's excitement is palpable in his letters. After months of working in relative isolation, he'll have a colleague, a collaborator, someone who understands the weight of artistic ambition. But even as he prepares for Gauguin's arrival, Vincent senses that something is shifting within him. The intensity that has fueled his remarkable productivity is becoming harder to manage. The line between passionate dedication and overwhelming obsession grows thinner with each passing day. The light that drew him to Arles, that beautiful, honest, revealing light. It illuminates not just the landscape around him, but the landscape within him. And what it reveals is both magnificent and troubling. As we pause here in Vincent's story, with autumn settling over the fields of Provence and the Yellow House prepared for its first guest, we're left with questions that echo beyond this specific moment in art history. What happens when our greatest strengths become our greatest vulnerabilities? How do we sustain the intensity required to build something meaningful without being consumed by it? Vincent van Gogh's journey through the light of southern France offers no easy answers. But perhaps, in the questions themselves, we might find something valuable. Something that speaks to the weight you carry, the vision you're pursuing, the delicate balance between dedication and preservation of self. The story continues from here, deeper into both triumph and struggle, as Vincent discovers what that southern light has been trying to teach him all along. The Yellow House and a troubled partnership. The Yellow House becomes more than shelter. It becomes symbol, sanctuary, and stage for Vincent's grandest vision yet. Picture him in those first weeks of spring, moving through the modest rooms with the careful attention of someone arranging pieces of a dream. The downstairs becomes his studio, easel positioned to catch the morning light streaming through windows he keeps spotless. Upstairs, he prepares a second bedroom. Not for storage, not for solitude, but for another artist, a collaborator, a fellow seeker drawn to this southern light. You know this feeling, perhaps. The moment when what you're building shifts from personal project to something larger. When the weight you carry begins to feel less like burden and more like responsibility. To others, to a vision that extends beyond yourself. Vincent calls his dream the Studio of the South. In letters to his brother Theo, his excitement spills across the pages like paint from an overloaded brush. He imagines artists arriving from Paris, from across Europe, drawn by the promise of this Mediterranean light and the fellowship of shared purpose. They would work together, learn from each other, create something unprecedented in the history of art. The Yellow House would be their headquarters, their sanctuary, their laboratory for new ways of seeing. He prepares obsessively. Painting after painting emerges from his easel. Sunflowers in blazing yellow, portraits of the postman Joseph Roulin, landscapes that seem to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Each canvas becomes both artwork and advertisement, proof of what this place can offer to those brave enough to join him. But beneath the excitement runs a deeper current, one you might recognize in your own ambitious moments. The fear that the vision might remain forever singular, that the weight you carry, the thing you're building, might never find its true collaborators. Vincent has been alone for so long. Then, in October of 1888, the impossible happens. Paul Gauguin steps off the train in Arles. Gauguin, already established, already celebrated in the Parisian art world that still views Vincent as eccentric outsider. Where Vincent is raw energy and instinctive response, Gauguin is calculated, theoretical, convinced that art should emerge from memory and imagination rather than direct observation. The contrast is immediate and electric. Vincent greets his guest with the enthusiasm of someone whose deepest hopes are finally materializing. He has prepared Gauguin's room with the care of a devoted host. The walls decorated with his sunflower paintings, the bed positioned to catch the morning light, every detail considered. For a few golden weeks, it works. They paint together, argue about technique over dinner, walk the countryside debating the nature of artistic truth. Vincent shows Gauguin his favorite spots: the bridge at Langlois, the gardens where he captures the dance of wind through cypress trees, the cafes where local characters pose unknowingly for future masterpieces. Gauguin, despite his reservations about this provincial town, finds himself productive. The energy is undeniable. Vincent's passion proves contagious, even to someone as self-possessed as his Parisian visitor. But you know how these partnerships can evolve, don't you? How the very qualities that initially attract can gradually become sources of friction. How two strong visions, when forced into close proximity, can either harmonize or clash with increasing intensity. Vincent paints what he sees. Gauguin paints what he remembers, what he imagines, what he believes should be. Vincent works with urgent spontaneity, racing to capture each moment before it transforms. Gauguin deliberates, constructs, builds his compositions like architectural plans. In the Yellow House's cramped quarters, these differences amplify. Vincent's need for connection, his hunger for validation, begins to feel overwhelming to his more reserved guest. Gauguin, accustomed to admiration and deference, finds Vincent's passionate challenges exhausting. What began as stimulating debate gradually becomes something sharper, more personal. The weight Vincent carries, his desperate hope that this collaboration might prove his worth, might validate his vision, might finally end his isolation, begins to press against Gauguin's own needs for independence and artistic authority. You understand this dynamic, perhaps, the way shared vision can become contested territory, how the very intensity that drives creation can also drive wedges between creators. The challenge of maintaining your authentic voice while remaining open to influence and collaboration. Their arguments grow more frequent, more heated. Vincent, sensing his dream beginning to fracture, responds with increasing urgency. He paints with even greater intensity, as if the quality of his work might somehow repair what's breaking between them. Gauguin, feeling trapped by Vincent's emotional demands and the provincial limitations of Arles, begins planning his escape back to Paris. The Yellow House, once symbol of artistic fellowship, becomes stage for a more complex drama. Two brilliant minds, each carrying their own weight, their own vision of what art should be and how artists should live, finding themselves fundamentally incompatible despite their mutual respect. Vincent creates some of his most powerful work during these weeks of mounting tension, as if the pressure itself becomes fuel for his creativity. The portraits from this period pulse with psychological intensity. His landscapes seem to vibrate with barely contained energy. Even his still lifes, simple arrangements of books or shoes, carry emotional weight that transforms the ordinary into something profound. But the cost is visible to anyone willing to look closely. The weight he carries grows heavier with each passing day. The dream of the studio of the South, once so clear and achievable, begins to feel like another disappointment in a life already heavy with them. Gauguin makes his intentions clear. He will return to Paris. The collaboration, despite its artistic fruits, cannot continue. Vincent receives this news like a physical blow. Not just the loss of a colleague, but the collapse of his grandest vision. The yellow house, prepared with such hope, will return to being simply his solitary workspace. The community he dreamed of building will remain forever unrealized. You know this moment, perhaps, when what you're building faces its greatest test, when the partnerships you've counted on reveal their limitations, when the weight you carry threatens to become unbearable, not because of external pressures, but because of the gap between vision and reality. The story of the Yellow House and its brief, intense experiment in artistic collaboration offers no simple lessons. Success and failure interweave in ways that resist easy categorization. The paintings created during these weeks rank among Vincent's finest achievements. Yet the human cost proves devastating. As December approaches and Gauguin prepares his departure, Vincent finds himself facing a familiar but deeper isolation. The southern light continues to pour through his studio windows, but now it illuminates not just possibility, but the complex reality of what it means to create, to collaborate, to carry the weight of ambitious vision in a world that doesn't always understand or support what you're building. The Yellow House stands ready for whatever comes next. Yachitui. Starry nights and inner turmoil. The Yellow House stands ready for whatever comes next. But what comes next tests the very foundations of everything Vincent has built. In these final weeks of December, as the mistral winds grow sharper and the days shorter, something shifts in the delicate ecosystem of the studio of the South. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of Vincent and Gauguin's collaboration now bubbles over into something more volatile, more dangerous. You know this feeling, don't you? When the pressure you've been managing so carefully suddenly becomes unmanageable. When the weight you carry, when what you're building, when it all threatens to overwhelm the very person trying to hold it together. Vincent feels it in his bones, this mounting anxiety. His letters to Theo become more urgent, more fragmented. He writes of sleepless nights, of a mind that won't quiet, of fears that seem to multiply in the darkness of the Yellow House. The very sanctuary he created now feels like a prison of his own making. Gauguin, for his part, grows increasingly uncomfortable with Vincent's intensity. Where he once found inspiration in his friend's passionate approach to art, he now sees something that unsettles him, something unpredictable and raw. The bohemian lifestyle they'd imagined has given way to a claustrophobic intimacy that neither man quite knows how to navigate. Their conversations, once animated discussions about color and technique, become strained affairs. Vincent pushes harder, talks faster, his eyes bright with an energy that seems to consume him from within. He speaks of their mission, their shared vision, but Gauguin hears desperation in these words, the sound of someone trying to hold on to something that's already slipping away. And Vincent knows it's slipping away. He can see it in Gauguin's polite distance, in the way his friend's gaze drifts toward the window when Vincent speaks of their future together. The dream of the artistic community, the brotherhood of painters working side by side, it's dissolving before his eyes. This is when Vincent turns to the night sky. There's something about darkness that calls to troubled minds, isn't there? When the day's responsibilities finally cease their demands, when the world grows quiet, that's when our deepest fears and longings emerge. For Vincent, these December nights in Arles become a canvas for his inner turmoil. He begins to paint the night with an intensity that borders on obsession. But these aren't peaceful evening scenes. They're psychological landscapes, windows into a mind grappling with isolation and the fear of abandonment. The stars in his paintings pulse with an almost violent energy, swirling across skies that seem to breathe with their own life. Look at how he renders the cypress trees during this period. Those dark, flame-like forms reaching desperately toward the heavens. They twist and writhe against the starry sky like prayers made visible, like the very embodiment of a soul stretching toward something it cannot quite reach. There's beauty in these works, yes, but there's also something unsettling, something that speaks to the chaos churning beneath the surface of his daily existence. The cypress becomes Vincent's symbol for this inner struggle. In the Mediterranean landscape, these trees are common enough, but in Vincent's hands, they transform into something altogether more profound. They become the visual language for what it feels like to be rooted yet reaching, grounded yet yearning for transcendence. You understand this duality, don't you? The way responsibility anchors us even as our ambitions pull us toward uncertain horizons. Vincent paints what so many of us feel but cannot express. That tension between stability and growth, between what is and what might be. As his mental state becomes more fragile, Vincent's relationship with his work intensifies. He paints with a fervor that concerns even him. His brush strokes grow more aggressive, more urgent. The paint seems to leap from his brush onto the canvas as if it has its own will, its own desperate need to exist. Gauguin watches this transformation with growing alarm. The colleague he'd come to work alongside is becoming someone he barely recognizes, someone whose passion has crossed the line into something that feels dangerous, unpredictable. The comfortable distance that Gauguin prefers in his relationships becomes impossible to maintain in the face of Vincent's raw emotional intensity. And Vincent senses this withdrawal. He feels Gauguin pulling away, sees the subtle signs that their partnership is ending. This rejection cuts deeper than professional disappointment. It strikes at the very core of his need for connection, for understanding, for someone who might share the burden of seeing the world as intensely as he does. The irony is heartbreaking, isn't it? That Vincent's greatest gift, his ability to feel and see and create with such profound depth, is also what isolates him from the very connections he craves most desperately. In these final days of their collaboration, Vincent throws himself into his night paintings with renewed urgency. It's as if he's trying to capture something essential before it disappears forever. Not just the visual beauty of the Provençal night sky, but the feeling of hope itself, the possibility that his vision might yet find a home in the world. The stars in these paintings seem to pulse with their own heartbeat. They're not distant points of light, but living things, burning with the same intensity that consumes Vincent himself. The night sky becomes a mirror for his inner landscape, vast, mysterious, beautiful, and somehow lonely, despite its magnificent scope. There's something prophetic in these works, something that speaks to the weight you carry in your own sleepless hours. When you lie awake at night, mind racing through the challenges that await tomorrow, do you ever look up at the stars and feel both infinitely small and profoundly connected to something larger than yourself? Vincent captures this paradox in paint, the way darkness can be both terrifying and comforting, the way solitude can be both crushing and creative. His cypress trees reach upward like prayers, like questions posed to an indifferent universe, like the very embodiment of human ambition striving against the constraints of earthly existence. As December deepens and Gauguin's departure becomes inevitable, Vincent's inner turmoil reaches a crescendo. The yellow house, once a symbol of hope and creative possibility, now feels like a vessel barely containing the storm of his emotions. The southern light that drew him to Arles continues to pour through his windows, but now it illuminates not just his canvases, but the fragility of everything he's tried to build. The stage is set for something to break, something that will test not just Vincent's resilience, but his very capacity to continue creating in a world that seems determined to misunderstand what he's trying to accomplish. In the darkness outside his studio, the cypress trees sway in the mistral wind, their forms dancing against the star-filled sky like shadows of the turmoil within. Seeking refuge, the asylum at Saint-Rémy. That breaking point arrives with devastating swiftness. On December 23, 1888, something fractures completely within Vincent. The details of that night remain shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obscurity. But the aftermath is undeniable. Blood, confusion, a severed ear. The yellow house, once a beacon of artistic hope, becomes a scene of crisis that will echo through art history. You know this feeling, don't you? Not the dramatic gesture, but the moment when the pressure you've been carrying finally exceeds what any human frame can bear. When the weight of expectations, the isolation of leadership, the constant pushing against an indifferent world, when it all becomes too much. Gauguin flees Arles immediately, never to return. The townspeople petition to have Vincent removed from his beloved yellow house. His dream of the studio of the South lies in ruins, and he finds himself facing a choice that no one should have to make. Between his freedom and his safety. Between his independence and his sanity. On May 8, 1889, Vincent makes a decision that requires extraordinary courage. He voluntarily admits himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in the nearby town of Saint-Rémy. Think about that word, voluntary. In an age when mental illness carried profound stigma, when asylums were places people disappeared into never to emerge, Vincent chooses to seek refuge. There's something profoundly wise in knowing when to step back, when to create boundaries between yourself and a world that demands too much. You understand this delicate calculation, the balance between pushing forward and protecting what remains of your capacity to create, to lead, to continue building what matters. The asylum sits nestled in the Alpilles Mountains, a former monastery converted to house those seeking healing for ailments of the mind. The irony isn't lost. A place once dedicated to spiritual contemplation, now serving those whose contemplations have led them too far into darkness. The building itself speaks of centuries of quiet refuge, thick stone walls, arched corridors, gardens enclosed by protective barriers. Vincent's room is sparse but sufficient. A simple bed, a chair, a small table by the window. But oh, that window. It looks out onto the asylum's walled garden, and beyond that, to the olive groves and wheat fields that stretch toward the mountains. From crisis comes this unexpected gift. A new landscape to discover, new subjects to paint, new ways of seeing. The olive trees become his first teachers in this place of healing. Ancient, gnarled, their silver-green leaves catching light in ways that seem almost supernatural. Vincent studies them with the intensity he once brought to the sunflowers of Arles, but now there's something different in his approach. A gentleness born of necessity, a recognition that he must husband his energy more carefully. In his painting, The Olive Trees, we see this new relationship with his subject matter. The brush strokes are still dynamic, still filled with that distinctive Van Gogh energy, but they're more controlled somehow. The swirling patterns in the sky echo the twisted branches below, creating a harmony between earth and heaven that speaks to a mind seeking its own equilibrium. The asylum's routine provides structure that Vincent has never known. Meals at set times, supervised walks in the garden, periods of rest enforced not by exhaustion, but by schedule. For someone who has lived entirely by the rhythms of inspiration and compulsion, this external framework becomes surprisingly liberating. You might recognize this paradox, how constraints can sometimes free us to focus on what truly matters. When the asylum doctors restrict his access to certain materials during his episodes, Vincent learns to work with what he has. When he's confined to the building during periods of illness, he paints what he can see from his window. Limitation becomes a teacher. The enclosed garden becomes a world unto itself. High walls create a sense of protection, but also of containment. Vincent paints these gardens repeatedly, finding in their bounded nature a metaphor for his own situation. Here is beauty within limits. Flowers that bloom despite being cut off from the wider world. Paths that lead somewhere meaningful even within confined space. His brushwork during this period develops a new quality, still energetic, but more rhythmic, more meditative. The swirling patterns that will make The Starry Night famous begin to emerge in these garden studies. It's as if the enforced stillness allows him to see the movement that underlies all apparent calm. The way wind moves through leaves, the way light shifts across stone walls, the way shadows dance even in the most protected spaces. The olive groves beyond the garden walls call to him constantly. When his condition allows, he's permitted to venture out with a supervisor to paint among these ancient trees. The olives of Provence are different from anything he's painted before. Neither the bold geometry of the sunflowers nor the dramatic verticals of the cypress trees. These are trees that speak of endurance, of surviving harsh conditions, of producing something valuable year after year despite adversity. In Olive Grove, painted during this period, we see Vincent's growing understanding of resilience. The trees bend, but don't break. Their roots run deep enough to find water even in dry seasons. Their branches reach in all directions, seeking light wherever it can be found. The painting technique itself mirrors this. Layers of paint built up gradually, each stroke supporting the others, creating strength through accumulated effort rather than single dramatic gestures. The mountains beyond provide a sense of permanence that soothes Vincent's restless spirit. The Alpilles have watched over this valley for millennia, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to the struggles of any individual, but somehow comforting in their steadfastness. He paints them as protective presences, solid and reliable in a world where so much feels uncertain. The asylum's other residents become part of Vincent's education in human resilience. He observes their struggles with compassion, recognizing in their battles something of his own. The attendants, too, earn his respect. People doing difficult work with little recognition, caring for those whom society has largely forgotten. Vincent begins to understand that he's not alone in carrying weight that sometimes becomes unbearable. His correspondence with his brother Theo during this period reveals a man learning to live with his limitations rather than constantly fighting against them. He writes of painting as a necessity, yes, but also as a form of meditation, a way of staying connected to beauty even when his mind threatens to pull him into darkness. The seasons change around the asylum, and Vincent documents each transformation. Spring brings new growth to the olive trees. Summer intensifies the light on the garden walls. Autumn turns the leaves to gold and amber. He's learning to work with natural rhythms rather than against them, to paint when he's able, to rest when he must, to trust that the creative impulse will return even after periods of darkness. In this place of seeking refuge, Vincent discovers something unexpected. That containment need not mean confinement, that seeking help is itself a form of courage, that sometimes the most profound growth happens within the smallest spaces. The asylum at Saint-Rémy becomes not just a place of healing, but a laboratory for a new kind of artistic vision, one that finds transcendence not in escape from limitation, but in the deep exploration of what remains possible within it. Painting within walls. The morning light filters through the tall windows of Saint-Paul-de-Moselle, casting gentle shadows across the stone floors. It's a different quality of light here in the asylum, softer perhaps, filtered through the protective walls that have become Vincent's world. And in this filtered light, he begins to discover something remarkable about the nature of creative work itself. Dr. Théophile Péron makes his rounds each morning, his footsteps echoing down the corridors with a rhythm that Vincent comes to find oddly comforting. The doctor is a practical man, not given to grand theories about art or madness, but he recognizes something in his patient that demands respect. "Monsieur Van Gogh," he says during one of their conversations, "your dedication to your work, it's quite extraordinary." Vincent looks up from his easel, paint still wet on his brush. "It's not dedication, doctor. It's necessity, like breathing. And perhaps this is what you understand too, in your own way, that the work you do, the weight you carry, it's not simply a choice you've made, but something essential to who you are. The challenge isn't to abandon this drive, but to learn how to sustain it, how to paint within the walls that life sometimes requires us to accept." The asylum garden becomes Vincent's primary studio now. It's an enclosed space, perhaps 30 meters square, surrounded by high stone walls that block the view of the mountains beyond. But within these walls, within these walls, Vincent discovers an entire universe waiting to be explored. He sets up his easel beneath the pine trees, watching the way the morning light catches the needles, turning them to gold. The other patients move through the garden like gentle spirits, some tending to small plots of vegetables, others simply sitting in the sun. There's Monsieur Poulet, who speaks only in whispers about the letters he's writing to his long-dead wife, and young Henri, who spends hours arranging pebbles in perfect geometric patterns, his face serene with concentration. Vincent paints them all, not as subjects of pity or curiosity, but as fellow travelers in the strange country of human experience. He sees in their quiet rituals something profound about the way we all seek meaning within whatever boundaries we find ourselves facing. "Look at how they find their peace," he writes to Theo, "not in grand gestures or dramatic escapes, but in the small, repeated acts of being human. There's a lesson here that I'm only beginning to understand." The irises bloom in late spring, a riot of purple and blue that seems almost impossibly vibrant against the muted stone of the garden walls. Vincent positions his easel close to the flower bed, so close that he can smell their sweet, earthy fragrance as he works. Each brush stroke becomes a meditation, the way the petals catch the light, the subtle variations in color from deep violet to pale lavender. He's developed a new rhythm here, a way of working that honors both his creative urgency and his need for stability. Morning painting sessions in the garden, when the light is clear and his mind feels most settled. Afternoons spent reading or walking the corridors, allowing his thoughts to process what he's captured on canvas. Evenings devoted to his correspondence, those lifeline letters to Theo that keep him connected to the world beyond these walls. "I'm learning something about patience," he writes. "Not the kind that waits passively for change, but the kind that works steadily within present circumstances, that finds richness in what others might dismiss as limitation." Perhaps this resonates with where you find yourself now, lying here in the quiet hours, thinking about the constraints you're navigating. The budget that won't stretch as far as your vision. The team that's smaller than you'd hoped. The market conditions that demand adaptation rather than expansion. These aren't failures of imagination. They're simply the walls within which you're called to paint. Dr. Perron allows Vincent increasing freedom as the weeks pass. He can paint outdoors under supervision, can take short walks beyond the garden walls, but Vincent finds himself drawn back to the enclosed spaces, to the courtyard with its ancient fountain, to the corridor where afternoon light streams through barred windows, creating patterns on the floor that shift like living things. There's something to be said for knowing your boundaries, he tells Dr. Perron during one of their sessions. When you can't go everywhere, you learn to see everything. The doctor nods thoughtfully. He's observed this patient for months now, watched him transform limitation into liberation through the simple act of sustained attention. Your work here, it has a quality I haven't seen before. A kind of intensity, but also peace. Vincent considers this. Perhaps that's what happens when you stop fighting the walls and start painting them instead. The summer brings new subjects to explore. The field beyond the garden wall, visible through the iron gate, becomes a study in longing and acceptance. Vincent paints it dozens of times, sometimes focusing on the wheat that waves in the mistral wind, sometimes on the cypress trees that stand like dark flames against the sky. Each version captures a different mood, a different understanding of what it means to observe life from a place of necessary remove. The other patients begin to gather when he paints, drawn by something they sense but can't name. They don't speak much. Words are often difficult here, but they form a gentle audience, finding their own peace in watching creation unfold, brushstroke by brushstroke. Vincent realizes he's building something here that he never managed to achieve in Arles. Not the grand artistic community he'd envisioned with Gauguin, but something quieter and perhaps more sustainable. A practice of making beauty that doesn't depend on external validation or perfect circumstances. I'm learning to paint not despite my limitations, he writes to Theo, but because of them. The walls don't block the light, they focus it. As autumn approaches, Vincent looks back on his months at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle with something approaching gratitude. Not for the illness that brought him here, but for what he's discovered about the nature of creative resilience. How the most profound work often emerges not from perfect conditions, but from the patient cultivation of whatever possibilities remain available. The irises have finished blooming now, their petals fallen to create a purple carpet beneath the pine trees. But Vincent continues to paint them from memory. Each canvas a meditation on the way beauty persists, even after its moment has passed. How the act of truly seeing something allows it to live forever within the work we create. In the growing twilight of the garden, as the day's painting session draws to a close, Vincent cleans his brushes with the methodical care of someone who has learned to honor both the work and the walls that contain it. Tomorrow will bring new light, new subjects, new opportunities to transform constraint into creation. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of Saint-Paul-de-Moselle, that mastery isn't about transcending limitations, but about learning to paint so beautifully within them that the walls themselves become part of the art. Landscapes of the soul. The walls had become part of the art, but it was through color and brushstroke that Vincent truly learned to speak the language of his soul. In those months at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle, something extraordinary began to emerge on his canvases. Not just paintings, but entire emotional landscapes, visual symphonies that captured not merely what he saw, but what he felt in the deepest chambers of his heart. Consider his irises. You've likely seen reproductions, but imagine standing before the original canvas, feeling the weight of paint applied with such passionate precision. The purple blooms don't simply sit upon the surface. They surge upward like flames of hope. Each petal catches light differently, some touched with lavender tenderness, others burning with royal intensity. Vincent painted these irises during his first week at the asylum, when uncertainty still clouded everything, when he didn't yet know whether this place would become prison or sanctuary. Yet look how he chose to see beauty. The orange marigolds dance between the dominant purples, a harmony he discovered not in spite of his circumstances, but because his heightened sensitivity allowed him to perceive relationships others might miss. The weight you carry, those moments when everything feels overwhelming. Vincent understood that sensation intimately, but he learned something profound about transformation. He discovered that intense feeling, when channeled through disciplined craft, becomes something larger than personal pain. Watch how his brush strokes evolved during this period. In his earlier works, the paint often fought against itself, urgent, sometimes desperate. But here in Saint-Rémy, his technique develops a different quality. Still energetic, still unmistakably his, but with a kind of rhythmic breathing. Look at his cypress trees, those dark sentinels that appear again and again in his work from this time. They're not simply botanical studies. They're portraits of endurance. See how they twist upward, their flame-like forms reaching toward stars that swirl in cosmic dance above them. In The Starry Night, painted from his asylum window but transformed by memory and imagination, the cypress in the foreground anchors everything. It's both earthbound and transcendent, rooted yet reaching, much like what you're building, perhaps. Grounded in practical reality, yet always stretching towards something greater. Vincent wrote to his brother about these trees, how they haunted him, how their dark forms against the Mediterranean sky seemed to embody something essential about the human condition, the way they bend but don't break, the way they find nourishment in rocky soil. His wheat fields from this period tell another story entirely. Golden waves that seem to breathe with life, painted during his supervised walks beyond the asylum walls. Here, his brush strokes become pure music, short, rhythmic marks that follow the grain's natural movement, creating surfaces that shimmer with captured sunlight. But notice something else in these wheat field paintings, the way he includes the mountains of the Alpilles in the background. Those ancient limestone peaks, weathered by millennia, provide perspective. They remind us that our immediate struggles, however intense, exist within a much larger story. This is perhaps Vincent's greatest gift to those of us who lie awake at night, minds racing through tomorrow's challenges. He shows us how to transform the raw material of difficult experience into something beautiful and meaningful. His color choices during this period become increasingly intentional. The complementary relationships, purple and yellow, blue and orange, create visual tensions that resolve into harmony. Like the way opposing forces in your own life, when held in proper balance, can generate unexpected energy. The asylum gardens appear repeatedly in his work, enclosed spaces that mirror his circumstances while celebrating what grows within boundaries. His painting of the hospital courtyard shows patients walking in circles, but Vincent focuses our attention on the fountain at the center, the way water catches light, the way life persists even in institutional spaces. What you're building, it too requires this kind of patient attention to what flourishes within constraints. Vincent learned that creativity doesn't require perfect freedom. Sometimes it requires exactly the opposite. The focused intensity that comes from working within defined limits. His self-portraits from this period reveal a man who has learned to look at himself with compassion. The swirling backgrounds, those rhythmic patterns that seem to emanate from his very being, they're not chaos. They're the visual representation of a mind that has learned to find pattern within turbulence. The weight you carry tonight, Vincent carried it too, but he discovered something remarkable. When we stop fighting our circumstances and instead learn to work with them, when we develop the patience to let our deepest responses find expression through disciplined practice, we create something that transcends our individual struggle. His paintings from Saint-Paul de Moselle don't deny difficulty. They transform it. They show us that our most challenging seasons can become our most generative if we learn to paint beautifully within whatever walls contain us. Finding peace in the light. And so, Vincent learned perhaps the most profound lesson of all, that our greatest work often emerges not from the absence of struggle, but from our willingness to remain present with whatever light we're given. In those final months at Saint-Paul de Moselle, something shifted in his relationship with the world around him. The cypress trees that had once seemed like dark flames of torment began to appear in his canvases as gentle guardians, their twisted forms reaching skyward with a kind of weathered grace. The enclosed gardens of the asylum, which might have felt like prisons, became intimate sanctuaries where he could study the subtle changes of light across stone walls and carefully tended flower beds. You see, Vincent had spent so much of his time in Arles fighting the isolation, fighting Gauguin's departure, fighting the gap between his vision and his circumstances. But here, within these protective walls, he began to practice a different kind of attention. He learned to work with the rhythms of his own mind, to paint when clarity came, and to rest when the darkness descended. There's something deeply moving about watching him discover this gentler approach to his craft. In his letters to Theo from this period, you can sense a man learning to be patient with himself, learning that the light he'd been chasing so desperately had been there all along, waiting for him to develop the eyes to see it properly. The sunflowers he painted during these months carry this new understanding. Unlike the explosive energy of his earlier Arles sunflowers, these later works seem to breathe with quiet contentment. Their golden faces turned not in desperate seeking, but in grateful acknowledgement of the light they've been given. Each petal rendered with the kind of careful attention that can only come from a mind that has learned to be still. And perhaps this is what Vincent's journey through southern France teaches us most clearly, that the light we're seeking isn't always the blazing revelation we imagine it will be. Sometimes, it's the soft illumination that comes from learning to work steadily within our limitations, the warm glow that emerges when we stop demanding that our circumstances be different, and instead ask what beauty might be possible right here, right now. The weight you carry, those endless calculations about cash flow and difficult conversations, the way your mind rehearses tomorrow's challenges even as your body begs for rest. Vincent understood this kind of mental turbulence intimately, but he also discovered something remarkable about the relationship between inner turmoil and creative response. His paintings from the asylum don't pretend that struggle doesn't exist. Instead, they show us how struggle can be transformed through patient, disciplined attention, how the very constraints that seem to limit us can become the framework within which our most authentic work emerges. Think of those olive groves he painted over and over, the way he returned to the same twisted trees in different light, at different seasons, with different emotional colorations. He wasn't trying to capture them perfectly once and move on. He was learning to see them more deeply, to understand how the same essential forms could hold infinite variations of meaning depending on the quality of attention he brought to them. This is perhaps what we most need to remember in those 2 a.m. moments when our minds won't quiet. That what we're building doesn't require us to transcend our human limitations. It asks us to work creatively within them, to find the sustainable rhythms that allow our deepest responses to find expression through disciplined practice. Vincent's time in southern France lasted less than 3 years, a brief chapter in a life that ended far too soon. But in those sun-drenched months, he managed to create a body of work that continues to offer solace and inspiration more than a century later. Not because he solved all his problems, not because he found perfect peace, but because he learned to paint beautifully with whatever light was available to him. The yellow house in Arles still stands, though much changed from Vincent's time. The asylum at Saint-Paul-de-Moselle has become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how creativity and healing might support each other. The olive groves and cypress trees continue their ancient dance with the Mediterranean light, offering the same lessons in resilience and renewal that Vincent learned to read in their forms. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of his journey lies not in these physical places, but in the paintings themselves. Those windows into a way of seeing that transforms difficulty into beauty, isolation into intimacy, constraint into creative possibility. When you look at his Starry Night over the Rhône, the way the gas lights of the town reflect like fallen stars in the dark water, you're seeing through the eyes of someone who learned to find wonder in the midst of struggle. When you study the thick, confident brushstrokes of his sunflowers, each mark placed with such intentional care, you're witnessing the fruit of a practice that honored both creative passion and necessary limitation. And so tonight, as you finally allow your own mind to settle, as you release the weight of decisions that can wait until tomorrow, perhaps you can carry with you something of Vincent's hard-won wisdom, the understanding that your most meaningful work doesn't require perfect conditions, that the light you need is often already present, waiting for you to develop the patience to see it clearly. The challenges you face in what you're building, the sleepless nights and difficult choices, these aren't obstacles to be overcome so much as raw materials to be transformed through steady, disciplined attention. Like Vincent with his olive trees, you can return again and again to the same essential challenges, finding new ways to work creatively within their constraints. Your phone is finally silent beside you. Those last emails answered, tomorrow's agenda acknowledged but set aside. In this quiet space, you might sense something of what Vincent discovered in those enclosed gardens of Saint-Paul-de-Moselle. That profound work often emerges not from the absence of limitation, but from learning to create beautifully within whatever walls contain us. The weight you carry is real, but it need not be carried alone or without purpose. Like Vincent's cypress trees, reaching skyward despite their twisted forms, like his sunflowers, turning toward whatever light is available, you too can learn to find grace within constraint, beauty within struggle, sustainable rhythm within the demands of what you're building. And as sleep finally begins to claim you, as your breathing deepens and your mind releases its grip on tomorrow's uncertainties, perhaps you can rest in the knowledge that Vincent's greatest discovery wasn't how to eliminate difficulty from the creative process, but how to work with such patient attention that even the most challenging circumstances could be transformed into something luminous, something that offers light to others long after the original struggle has passed, something that whispers across the years that our deepest work emerges not when we transcend our humanity, but when we learn to paint with whatever colors we've been given, in whatever light we find ourselves, with the steady hand that comes from knowing that this moment, this breath, This opportunity to create something meaningful from the raw materials of our experience is always enough.